All right. There we go. We are live. So our roadmap, it's finally time for OAuth. We've been waiting and dreading maybe this day, but the day is here and OAuth starts today. We're going to go slightly out of order, which is really going to mess with your head a little bit because Terry's going to get into the flow before Edith actually tells you all the different parts of the flow. So apologies for that, but we want to make sure Terry has time to cover his material and he's going to need to drop. So Edith, thank you for your flexibility. And for the rest of you, we are recording the session. So, go back later and cover Edith's part if you didn't quite catch what was going on in the flow that Terry's talking about. The first two flows we're covering today, the web server auth and the user agent flow, they are the two most important OAuth flows you need to know. So pay extra careful attention to what's going on today. And Terry, I'm going to pass it over to you so you can get going.
Thanks. All right, can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Yeah, and thanks for letting me go a little early here so I can get off to a client meeting here. And I'm going to kind of skip over a couple of these slides, but this is a topic that confused the heck out of me, and so it helped me to kind of get a basic understanding, which I'm guessing may come in the next presentation that's happening today. So they're in my slide deck if you're interested in them, but some of the steps to set it up, what it is, and just some kind of basic definitions that helped me to kind of get my head wrapped around these concepts a little bit. But web server flow is the topic that I have, and this one is used when you have two secure servers talking to each other. And so that is a requirement that is hosted on a secure server. The web server flow must be able to protect the consumer key, which is why it's important that it is secured. You are able to use a challenge and verify parameters in your flow to prevent any type of interception attacks. And I can kind of show you where some of those are at as we actually drill into the flow a little bit. Typically, I should put this in presentation mode because some of these get a little small, sorry. Typically, it's used for web applications where the server-side code needs to interact with force.com APIs or on the user's behalf. So that's the web server flow, and this is what it looks like. And it's 6 different steps, and we'll go over each of those and what all happens inside those. So, step number 1, the application redirects the user to the Salesforce authorization endpoint. That endpoint is one that I've got indicated in one of the earlier slides, but it's in essence, it looks like this one right here at the bottom in my example. So it's services /OAuth2/authorize. It does have 3 required parameters, and that's the response type, and that's always set to the word code. And then your client ID is your consumer key, and that consumer key is established when you create your connected app, as well as the redirect URL. That's the callback URL that you'd have in your connected app as well. And you'll see that down here in the examples. So we've got our client ID, looks like this big, nice, easy to type in value. Then we have our redirect URL. And then here's our response code as type as well. Some optional parameters. I mentioned that you can do a code challenge and verify, and that just ensures that your communication hasn't been intercepted. And so code challenge would just become another parameter in the example that we have down below. Display is also an option. That's used to modify the look of what's being presented to the users for their login page. So if you're on a mobile device, you might want that to look a little bit different than if you're on a full desktop. And then scope, you'll hear about, I'm sure, in the next presentation, specifies what what you're authorizing or allowing the login or the access to be. And then we've already kind of talked here about the example right there at the bottom. So that's step number one. And so kind of following our picture here, step two is the user logs in with their credentials. So they are presented with an actual login screen. The user at this point is interacting directly with the endpoint, so the app never actually captures the user's credentials. After successfully logging in, the user is asked then to authorize the app. And so that's when you get that screen that comes up where you have to either approve or say, no, I don't want to allow them to have access to the app. Not sure why you'd ever deny it. If you logged in, you're probably going to go ahead and authorize that. But that is step number two. So moving to step three, which is this one. After Salesforce has confirmed that the client app is authorized, the end user's web browser is redirected to the callback URL. Again, that callback URL is defined in the connected app on the Salesforce side. Salesforce appends the authorization information to the redirect URL with the following parameters. And again, you'll see those here as examples. So code, that's the authorization code the consumer must use to obtain access and refresh tokens. This is the one that expires quickly. So you only have so much time for this particular authorization code. Again, that's this long, pretty, whoa, where'd that go? Well, that was, okay, sorry. Then the state value is passed as part of the initial request, if applicable. And I don't remember exactly what that state represented.
That state is basically used for security. It's supposed to be like another unguessable kind of cryptic string, and it's used when you make the request to the authorization server. It sends the state back to you, and it's kind of verification for you that the information's coming where you expect it to come from.
Okay.
It's an extra layer of security, optional, but highly recommended.
So I actually read something different, and I've used this parameter for a different purpose. But probably what you mentioned just now is also usable for security purposes. The state is typically used to pass in some additional information into OAuth to kind of indicate a state of application. Sometimes you can pass some parameter within it. But that also gets restricted, and it doesn't let you pass everything you want. But that's one way to interact with the OAuth flow without sort of trashing all the security violations in there.
Cool. Very good. That's helpful. All right. Moving to step 4 is, so we had our this is where the application extracts the authorization code and passes the request to Salesforce for an access token. So we had our temporary token, and guys, correct me if I misunderstand how this works, but in step 3, we got a temporary access token, and here we're getting our permanent token, or not, I shouldn't call it permanent, but one that we can use as we are using the application. So this one, is it safe to say just lasts a little longer than our temporary one from the original?
Well, the code basically just gives you permission to get access to the resources, but it doesn't actually give, it's like permission to get permission practically.
There you go.
Yeah, that's a temporary 15-minute lasting thing, but then what you're getting back is the session ID, right? So session ID lasts as long as your session is set in Salesforce. If it's set 24 hours, that's how long it's going to be live. Set for 4 hours you wanted to set in Salesforce. That defines what that token will be alive for.
Okay. All right. So, and this is a post request that's sent to the appropriate Salesforce token request endpoint. So that's the URL as an example. Parameters that can be included in this one are the grant type. And this, my understanding, has to be set to authorization_code. The client secret, which in our connected app is called consumer secret. The client ID is the consumer key. And then the redirect URI is the callback URL. All of those coming out of our connected app once we've set that up.
URI really confused me for a long time, and really it's just where the calling app wants you to send the information to, and really the other side, kind of this app that's requesting all these tokens, should be telling you what to set that callback URL value to. And it took me the longest time to understand that.
Okay, say that one more time if you don't mind.
Sure. So the client application, the thing that's ultimately going to get access to this user's resources, that's the thing that really determines what that callback URL is going to be. And for me, for the longest time, like when I'd set up the client app, I go, well, I don't know what to put in this callback URL. And I would guess and put random bits of information in there. But it really comes down to, it's where the client is going to want you to send the data back.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then our code is the authorization code that we received back in step number 3. And so that might look something like the example down here below, and you can see the different parameters all spelled out here as well.
So it's also probably good to mention that this, I think this post request that you're talking about here, this will come back to this URI that you have there. For example, it's a www.mysite.com callback. So this payload that you have as an example there for authorization code, that's what will be sent during that callback stuff.
Okay. Good.
Now, is this also where you receive a refresh token, if you provided that within your scope?
Yes. Yeah, you'll be getting a refresh token. So this is the last step. Oh, I'm sorry. So I think that's a last step in the process, and you'll be getting a refresh token.
Oh, as part of the 5, when you actually make your request to get the resources, when you make the request to get the resources.
No, it comes back with the session ID. So you get the token,
okay. That's what I thought. Okay.
Token and session ID come together from that last request.
Yeah. All right. So kind of going right in then to step 5, that's the granting access. If the request is successful, the server responds or returns a response body that contains the following items. And here's our example. This is a JSON version. This can come back as XML or URL encoded, and you get to specify that. I think it was in one of these previous steps. It's an optional parameter that lets you determine how you want to receive it back. So your access token, that's your session, access your session ID. Your refresh token, which Jeff, you were asking about, is obtained to obtain new access tokens. That's this nice, pretty thing. The instant URL is the Salesforce instance to which the API calls are sent. So that looks a lot like our Salesforce my domain names. Then let's see where I lost my spot. ID is the URL to get more information about the user. So that's this first one. And you can see that we're passing in the user ID here. So I'm assuming that is what we would leverage to get additional information about this particular user. The issued at is basically the timestamp is what it sounded like to me. Is that a pretty safe way to say that?
Correct. I think that helps then guide the age of the session.
Yeah, okay.
And is this that same thing, seconds since January 1st of 1970? A lot of the times are basically like they call it like epic time, where it's like the number of seconds since midnight at January 1st of 1970.
Yeah, yep, epic time, yep. It's a Unix thing, it sounds like, from the documentation.
Yeah.
All right, and then the signature used to verify the URL identity was not modified. And that's this guy. And that talked about the client secret, and it was concatenated with the issue at. And I wasn't sure quite how that was represented in this example, but
I wonder if they use one as the hash for the other or something, or if it's base 64 encoding, maybe.
That's what it is. It's encoding, yeah.
Yeah, it does say base 64 encoded. Okay, cool. You guys are awesome. All right, so now we get to the easier one. The last step is the application uses a provided access token and refresh tokens to access the protected user information. So that gets them in, and they are starting to use the application at this point.
And I think this is the critical part of this flow, because the whole user ID login and so forth is one time to get it started, to get that initial access token. The fact that refresh token comes back, that is what then ongoing allows the web server to continue to make calls and not have to have a user involved again. I think that's the whole key to this web server flow, if I'm not mistaken, is the initial login to get the access token that then gives you the refresh, and that refresh is then used on an ongoing basis for the two servers to talk to each other.
Yeah, there's a couple of points that I remember about this. Number one, that it is a two-step process, that first you get your access code or your authorization code, then you go back and get your actual token. And the fact that you go first to the authorized endpoint, then to the token endpoint. And then you'll see the next flow we do, it's not that two-step process, it's actually a one-step process.
Right. And that's what I have. Any other thoughts or questions on this one?
Yeah. The one thing when I was reading the documentation, this whole thing about, oh, well, the application must be capable of protecting the consumer secret. I'm like, well, what the hell does that even mean? And what it means is the fact that because that data is sitting on a web server, the end user can't go looking at the web server code basically to try to find out what that secret is. Whereas like on desktop or mobile, theoretically, they could get into the source code because it's sitting on their computer and they could somehow try to figure out what the secret is. So it's just the fact that that secret is only stored in one location on the server, and very few people actually have access to that code to be able to look at it.
Good. All right, that's what I had for the web service flow.
Okay, cool. And now some of this will make more sense because Edith is going to tell us what all those things are that Terry just showed you in the flow.
Hi, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So let's start. So I am going to talk about the components that for OAuth. Many of them have been mentioned by this flow already. So first of all, well, just a little reminder that this is an open standard for authorization and just basically enables a third-party application to obtain limited access to an HTTP service. And in my mind, it was always a person that is the owner of the data, for example, has to approve something for the client application, for example, a mobile application, to access my resources. But we will see later on all the flows that it's not really just one person, that's just one of the flows or some of them, but it can be communication between device and server, or server to server, as we already saw, something like that. So it can be a person or a user or a third party, a client application itself. So the first concept I'm going to be talking about is the roles. And in this diagram, we can see the four of them that I want to talk about. The first one is the resource owner, that basically is the person or the user that wants to access or use the client application. And This can be, for example, me, Edith, wanting to use Salesforce using my mobile application. So the second role would be the client, that is the application itself, that wants to access the resources or the data. In this case, this would be the mobile application itself. We also have the third role, that is the resource server. In this case, could be Salesforce, that is the one that stores all the data. So my mobile application wants to access the data that is stored on Salesforce on my behalf. And the fourth role is the authorization server. As we saw in previous study sessions, the authorization server can be another server, or it can be Salesforce itself. But in this case, we assume that it's another server, for example. And this is the one that the client is going to request the tokens from. So the user is going to authenticate in my authorization server, and is going to grant all the access for my client to be able to use my resources or my data in the resource server. So the next concept would be the client types. We have two different types. The first one will be a confidential one. And it's what Natalya just mentioned, is that clients are able to maintain the confidentiality of their credentials. As she mentioned, is that, for example, I have a secure server where I just have, like, I don't know, 1 or 2 admins that are root, and they are the only ones that can access a specific directory where I'm going to be storing my credentials. And the other one would be the public one that she also mentioned, that, for example, I have a mobile application in my example is not secure because I can be leaving my mobile wherever, and just the code is all there. Another concept would be the tokens that were mentioned before. So we have different types of tokens that we even saw on the examples already being used. The first one is the consumer key. And this is the one that we are going to use to identify the client with my resource server. And this basically is when we set up our connected app, we get this consumer key that then we have to move and put on the code, for example, for my mobile application to tell Salesforce that I am going to be using this connected app, for example. The other one is the access token. And it was, as it was mentioned before, this access token is the one that really represents the permission of the user for the client to access the data. So this is the one that is going to be used in data requests by the client to get all my data and my resources. This is, as it was mentioned before, it's going to last as long as the session. So it's not as short-lived as the first one that is just, sorry, the authorization code that is just for 15 minutes. And I also can have a refresh token. This is just used to request a new access token. When my access token has, the session has logged out, I can use this refresh token to get more access tokens later. And finally, the authorization code. This is the one that we saw at the beginning of the flow. That is just 15 minutes. It's just lasting 15 minutes, and it's used by the client to request access token or refresh tokens from the authorization server. Another concept would be scopes that was mentioned in the example as well. So the scope is basically a way to restrict access to specific areas in my resource server. So basically, generally, when we see the examples, it's going to be a comma-separated or space-delimited list of strings. And basically, in Salesforce, we have all of these scopes that we can use and specify in our connected apps. So the first one is whenever we want to let the client to access the APIs. Could be the bulk API or REST API, even the Chatter API. If I want my client just to have access to my Chatter API, I use the second scope, Chatter API. If I have a connected app that has specific or custom permissions for a set of users, I use the third one, the custom permissions scope. If I want to give my client full access to all the data that my user that is logged in can access, I just put the full. And it was very insistent in the documentation that even if you put full, but you want a refresh token, you have to specify both, because the full doesn't include the refresh token. The ID, we also saw in the example before, the ID basically lets me get more information about the identity of the user. That could be the email or phone or more information about it. I have another one that is the OpenID. If we remember, the OpenID sits on top of OAuth. So what it allows me is to get an ID token that is going to be signed, and it's going to have much more information than the one that I just get from OAuth directly. The refresh token is the one that is going to return the refresh token as well when I request, when I exchange my access token with my authorization server. If I am a developer and I create Visualforce pages, and that's the only thing that I want to my client to access, that custom code for Visualforce, I use this scope Visualforce. But if I want to give access to all of the pages that, or all of the web interface that that is sitting on Salesforce, I use the last scope, that is web. If you have any questions, just say when you want. Okay, the next concept is grant types. Grant type is used in all of the flows to specify basically the way that I am going to be getting the tokens from the authorization server. The first one is the authorization code, and is the one that we just saw right now in the example. So this is used every time I want to use this OAuth in a web server or a browser-based and mobile applications. So for all of those type of clients, I can use this authorization code. I have another grant type that is called implicit. This is specified in the OAuth specification. And sometimes they say that this can be used for JavaScript applications that are executing on the user browser. Basically, what is different from the previous one is, as we saw before, the first one requires an access token. And then with that access token, I need a code at the beginning. And then with that code, I can get the access token from my authorization server. But in this one, the first code is not used, and the access token is sent directly to the client. But I was reading, like in some other resources, that this is not advised to use because it's not as secure. So they were saying that it's better to use the first one with extra parameters, as we saw in the example. Like, for example, a code that we just create from the client and send it to the server. And the first time we access, and the next time that we want to get the access token, we send the same code, so the server can verify that we are who we say we are. So this implicit is like not that recommended, but it's part of the OAuth specification anyway. The other grant type that we have is the resource owner password credentials, and this basically is we sending the username and password of the user or the resource owner that wants to access the data or the resources. This is obviously it's not that advised to be using, but just for example, maybe if you are in a server where you have lots of security, or on an environment where you know that the place where you are storing the information is not going to be seen by many people, you can use this one as well. There is another one where we can use the client credentials. Instead of using the user or the resource owner credentials, we are going to be using the client. So for example, maybe could be that I have one application that is going to be connected to my resource server, and I want all of the customers or all my users that connect to that application to use exactly the same set of permissions, or let's just have one username and password for the whole client application, regardless of the person or the user that is accessing it. And this is basically used to machine-to-machine communication as well. So if I have a server communicating with another one. The other grant type that we are going to see this more in detail in the flows when we are analyzing them. Well, but in high level is the device code. And this device code is used to communicate when we have like devices that don't have access to or easy access to a web browser. We use a code at the beginning, and then we use that code later to get the access tokens. And another grant type is the refresh token that it basically will let me to get more tokens when my access token session is ends. And there are some other extensions that are part of the flows that we will be seeing later, and those are basically extension grants. One example is the one that is using SAML. It's not part of the OAuth specification itself, but we can extend this OAuth by adding additional parameters, basically just to the request. And I think that's all.
One thing on here, on authorization code, you say it's apps running in mobile apps. And I thought for mobile apps, you wanted to actually use the implicit flow because the secret can't be protected.
Well, in the mobile apps, secret is actually protected because these secrets are typically stored in the... so you can only use in a mobile application, if it's native application, you can only use these flows, for example, like mobile SDK and stuff. That's only used with a native or hybrid application when you have physically native container that interacts with the device. And then once you do that, the storage of secrets and whatever authorization you get goes into a secure key store on the device, which user cannot read, or even a developer, you can't really get access to it easily. So it is secure in a way, but yes, you're taking it with you, so that could be broken potentially. So there's some potential, but very low.
Oh, okay.
So the keychain, for example, an iPhone keychain store would be an encrypted secure store on the device that very difficult to break if you had to, for instance. On Android will be another type of keychain that they use. I don't know what they internal, but it is still encrypted.
Edith, can you go back to the scope slide for a second? So just a couple of other things, a couple of things that I thought might be notable, might show up on the exam is that ID scope comes along with every other scope that you see here. So you always have access to that scope because you always potentially will want to know information about the user. It's kind of like the lowest level of the least privileged amount of information you can get, but it is included with everything else. And then the big point on Visualforce is, like Edith said, you can only access the Visualforce pages. You can't use the standard Salesforce pages if the only scope you're getting is the Visualforce scope.
I think another point here is, I think refresh token does not come with any scopes other than refresh token scope. So if your connected app decided not to give you that scope, then you will not get this refresh token, and ultimately your OAuth will probably not work.
Yeah, and I had multiple questions on the exam about refresh token that dealt with refresh tokens expiring.
Right. Yeah, and a little bit on the other one. So without the refresh token, your initial auth will work and you can get access. It's just when that session ends or you come in later, you're going to have to be logging in every time. So I think without the refresh token, you will get that initial connection through if you've got the access token. It's just once your session goes out or once you come back later on, then you're going to have to re-log in each time.
Yeah, that's essentially the idea, that you can't get kind of seamless user experience with it. They'll have to log back in with user password all the time.
Right.
Has any used these custom permissions? Because I just know what it's saying in the documentation, but I haven't used it myself.
Nor have I.
No. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Edith. Svatka, you're up next. Oh, just a reminder, we might end up running over time with some of these. As you're preparing presentations, please do try to keep within the 10 to 15 minute window. But because of the nature of these things, and we want to make sure we get full understanding, the group did vote that if we go long, we go long, with the understanding that the session is recorded, and if you need to drop, then by all means drop to get to your next thing.
Okay, so looks like since I got dual screens, I'll just run in this mode here. So I have the user agent flow. So it's the flow that currently, or it's primarily used for mobile and desktop applications. Hence this little pretty iPhone here on the right-hand side. No donuts for you guys today. Oh, I don't remember who was talking about donuts, but I think there was a donut special on Krispy Kreme this morning. I have it on.
Ooh, that was David.
I know, so.
He's got a long drive this morning too.
So the client app that runs on a device or a browser use this to obtain the access token. And there was this notion of the tokens being returned best with a hash fragment on the URL, which I have a couple slides down. So I'll show you guys what that looks like. It's similar to what Terry was showing. And similar warning that Edith was just talking through, because there it is, the redirection URI actually contains all of the information that it may or may not be exposed. So that's one thing that I think, now, Natalya, you were mentioning about the implicit in JavaScript. I think there are other ways that you can protect the URI. So the flow definitely is a lot closer, a lot smaller than what the web server one was. So in here, what we have is the client app directs a user to Salesforce to authenticate and authorize the app. So it's in a step 1 here. The user is prompted to approve. Once you log in, actually, you're going to be prompted to approve the information that you're going to share with the application. It's information about you. And then the app receives a callback. Now, what does the callback look like is something that I'm going to show right after I actually run this quick demo as a show and tell.
Oh,
I thought it would be fun. You know, I mean, come on, this is like 2 minutes. And everybody can send me a note then. I have an easy Gmail. So once you log in, here is the allow access. You can choose to say deny or allow. Terry was joking about why would you, right? But so once you actually allow, you can continue with the data loading. But what I thought was interesting here is if I want to choose to revoke this application, where do I go about doing that? So you would go to my settings, and then from my settings, you would go to connections. My data loader actually showed up right here, and here's where you can actually choose to revoke the data loader app. So that's how simple that was.
Real quickly, because I know it's been mentioned a couple times on that page that comes up for you to authorize. I think you would want to deny it if you look in that list and say, you know what, I really don't want to give that kind of access, because they should be outlining what scopes you've defined. And just because you're trying to get into a system doesn't necessarily mean you want to open up the world to that system of your device. So if they've included more things than you want to provide, then you may want to say, no, I don't want you to have that kind of access. I'm going to reject it.
Right there with you. And I've done it on mobile apps a number of times.
Right.
And I'm like, you might be asking for a little too much.
Yeah, myself too on mobile, I see that, you know, you want to get a hold of a little more than I think I'm willing to give you right now. So.
That's a really good pointer.
And a well-designed app will still run even if you don't give it some of the permissions. But some of them just won't work without giving them access. So depends on how it was written.
Yeah. And so here I was thinking about sort of extrapolating the example of the callback from the server. And so past the hash, right, past the URL here, the callback, we have the access token, the refresh token, you got the URL. Talk a little bit, and I think Terry did actually a really good job specifying all those, so I don't think I'm going to repeat it as much. And I think we all went that same direction, looking at a URL and thinking, what is this, right? It's so many variables, and every one of them has a rhyme and reason, but why and how? So even looking at the issue that I was looking the same way, had no idea that it is number of seconds past 1970 some. That's a fascinating fact. And okay, so then we talked about signature, which is the encoded version of concatenating ID and issue at. And a scope is something that I really appreciate Edith and you guys talking through, because that one was quite a wild card for me when I was looking at it. Just didn't quite make sense what that meant, you know. And neither can there is really no way for us to configure this. This came right back, right? So I would imagine that the system that is trying to receive access for you will actually be doing majority of this, because me as a user from the front side, I have no access to configuring any of those. And that's really all I had, since it is such an easy flow as it is. Again, the biggest pieces here, you guys, if you had to choose which one, right? Mobile and application, we will want to go the user agent authentication flow.
And JavaScript.
And JavaScript, thank you. That's a good one. Yep.
Yeah, so on the, can you go back to slide 5 with the scope? One thing you talked about where you cannot configure the scope, but you can only request a subset of what's configured on the connected app. So if the connected app says, okay, we can give ID and we can give visual force, and you try to ask for web, it's going to deny you because it's not one of the allowed things that the server will give you. You can ask for less than what's set up in the connected app. You can ask for everything that's set up in the connected app. You can't ask for more than what the connected app is set for.
So it's similar to like when you say select all from a table, this is select ID, API, refresh token, not tomorrow. Right. You're not getting visual first page.
That's a good analogy. I like that.
Yeah.
You can't select something that isn't in the table itself. That's really good.
Or in a query. Any questions? See, we're going to stay on time. I am really ready to make sure that we stayed on time. And I did put some work in here, serious work.
In here, the first request that the client does to the authentication server is a grant type implicit.
Grant type is implicit for this flow.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, the only other thing that I caught when I was studying for this is this goes directly to the token endpoint, where the web server's flow first goes to the authorization endpoint, like the /authorize. That's where the user logs in. On this one, the user logs in at the token endpoint, which is kind of weird. But actually, no, I take that. Oh, now I'm getting myself confused. Anyway, check on that, on which endpoint it goes to.
I think it doesn't go to the token. I think it is going to the front door community URL to log in.
That's right, but the token is coming from the authorized endpoint instead of from the token endpoint. That's what it is. Okay.
Yeah, I think this has to do with the grants that is being requested.
I put a link in the extra resources, I think. There's a Pluralsight course that's really good. They have really nice diagrams on what endpoints all the different flows go to. Very helpful for me. Okay, thank you, Svatka. Igor, you're up next. Refresh tokens. Thank you for joining us even after passing your exam.
All right, let's see if I can manage the presentation here. Hopefully this would work. Okay. Do you guys see my screen?
Yes. All you can drink.
All right. So the refresh token flow is kind of a quick, I guess, simple. So hopefully it won't take much time, but I'm going to show you something hopefully interesting. So this is, I equate this to somewhat all you can drink kind of bar where you go in and have a ticket that lets you in. And then with that ticket, you can go back to the bar to get as many drinks as you like, right? And you keep going for the whole night if you want to, or exit whenever. So that's kind of what refresh token grants you, as long as it's been given sort of like forever. And I'll show you a little bit on how that's controlled in a connected app in there. A couple of things here about refresh token, origination of refresh token. It comes in with the either user agent flow or web server flow. It's been already detailed by Svatka and other folks on this call. Thank you for that. And then basically, refresh token is what's allowing you to get a new access token, which is in Salesforce ecosystem, is really a session ID, right? So the session ID will live as long as is set by Salesforce. And then your consumer, or frequently in the text and documentation refers as consumer. I kind of want to refer to this as an app, really, because a person or a consumer would never really do anything with these tokens. It's mostly an app and programming that will do that. So the app is really responsible to finding out when the access is expired, right? And typically how that happens is when you activate an app on a mobile or on your web browser, and it goes out to make a request, it receives some type of an error or maybe exception, depending on which programming language is being used. And it has to handle that exception gracefully, grab a refresh token from the storage and go get the new token to access, and then rekindle your request again, right? Now, there's another thing I've read in documentation, which I actually haven't bumped to before. It says bearer flow can be used after consumer gets the refresh token. I'm not sure how that plays. I don't know if anybody had experience with bearer flows or bearer token flows and refresh tokens. I haven't had experience with that, so I can't speak to it, but I know documentation has stated this. So anyway, and request for the refresh token, grant type has to be a refresh token. Essentially, you need to have that if you want to get a refresh token in there. But it will be coming in an initial sort of when you get your authorization, and then you go get your data or actually get authenticated with that authorization code. When you get a session ID, refresh token will come with it if the scopes have allowed you to be defined for that. And then another two things to be noted: refresh tokens can be done with this post request, right? And it can be requested either with post parameters in the body, as kind of showing in here, where this is the kind of part of an endpoint, and that's how the grant happens, right? And then this is essentially how your application. This is what application would use to get a new access token, for example, right? So because you're sending a refresh token, and you're going to get a, basically sending in a client ID and a secret, and then you're going to post your existing refresh token here from your application, and it will respond back with a new session for you to refresh it. So you can have ability to pass as parameters or as basic authentication scheme. I have both of them examples here. That's kind of what the basic authentication scheme would look like. Somewhat similar thing, and then it's kind of in the documentation, same thing. And this is a response. So a response can be done in JSON, XML, or URL encoded. This is I posted just one example here in XML because it's easier to read, and that's kind of what you can expect from your. So you get your access token here from when you send your refresh token, you get your access token back, which is kind of looks like this. And then you have the rest of the information here as your normal other requests that you've seen before. Now you may have some other scopes that allow you some more information here, but in this case, this is just an example that was given. I also provided here several links to documentation, which basically talks about how refresh tokens, refresh flows is used. And so another thing I wanted to show you quickly is, so this is a connected app on one of my example applications, right? And in here we have a part of the managing policies. You could see my refresh token policy says refresh token is valid until revoked, which means basically an admin has a power to revoke my app, as Svatka was showing a list of that. But you could change this, and you could say my refresh token have these several options. It could be immediately expired, which kind of reduces the meaning of refresh token to begin with. Then you have this token can be used after so many days, or for so many days, and then expire refresh token after so many days. So there's different policies depending on what organization may want you to set for your refresh token. You could actually control it here of how that would affect your refresh token and the user experience with it. And it really typically at least for mobile applications, I've never seen people use anything else other than a refresh token from practical point of view to be valid until revoked, simply because that's what you really want. You want users to come in your mobile app, log in once, and never really remember that password again. And so that's what gives you that ability. And so I have actually the web server flow that shows a little bit of a demonstration here. That so I have my Heroku application here. Let's go in and see what it does. This is, by the way, my open source app. So this is a web app learning on Heroku. And I can log in here with my developer credentials. Let's go into, this is one of my dev orgs for Dreamforce 18 presentation. Let's go in, log in. So once we log in, so we now in my web app, the app just received, here's my refresh token, is what it looks like. Here's my session token, right? And some information. I mean, I didn't print all of it, but I got what I wanted, instant URL, access token, refresh token. And so now I can just query quickly an example. So this is queries the contacts, like 10 contacts out of my org. So that's really kind of quickly what you can expect to see in that flow. One thing I find interesting in these, all of the OAuth sort of dance with connected apps is the fact that if you noticed, I logged into my dev org, but actually this connected app for my SFOS Java example lives in a completely different org. It's my Salesforce schema, like a schema navigator, had a force navigator tool built many years ago. And that's kind of where it lives. But yet it allows me to log into any dev org or any production org or sandbox I want with this credentials and gives me the scopes for this. How does this actually happen, right? Why is it even allowing me to do this? Because clearly, my connected app lives here, but sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. My connected apps live in this org, but I'm connecting to different orgs, and it's still allowing. Well, the way that happens is Salesforce provides something called a centralized IDP that they built. And that IDP controls access to pretty much all of the APIs and all of the things we do. Every time you go to login screen, that pretty much goes through the IDP. And so that IDP actually has things already pre-coded for you. And once it finds that, okay, you have an org out there with this connected app with this key, we can authorize this org. And so it's essentially kind of federating your access for you without knowing. That's how mobile apps, like think about your mobile application. When you install or deploy Salesforce Mobile, you never really deal with connected app unless you actually go and install one and fiddle with it. But you can connect immediately and start using it, right? When you build a first-time mobile SDK app, it gives you this pre-coded key and consumer secret within the app from an SDK. Where it come from? It's a centralized IDP, one global access point, and one global callback that allows you to do that. So just something interesting to know.
That's really cool. I was wondering how that happened, because or when you go to Workbench, it's like it's just there. How did that work?
Yeah, it's a central IDP that controls that access. So any questions?
I love the all-you-can-drink analogy. And it's the same thing, like all you can drink until the bar closes. So that's like your refresh token expiration. It's like bar's closed, you can't drink anymore past that.
Yeah, so another thing too is to know about refresh tokens. They're not refreshable, right? So like you can't just keep going back and refresh tokens. You have to actually log in. So refresh token is bound by that policy that I showed you in this connected app, right? So if we go to one of these. So this is a connected app. I have several scopes here that I defined, and I have my callbacks, but my manage data here, manage policies is what defines my scopes, my refresh token policy. So I told it to be, until I revoke it. So that means that it lives forever. But I can't go back and refresh this token. I would have to, like, if somebody revoked it, or let's say I had a different policy, say it was 30 days after I logged in, I need to refresh just for security reasons. Like some organizations might be more strict about it. and so they may set this policy to keep asking people to relog back in like every 30 days, let's say. Then that would be the time. I can think of this as in some of my recent work. It's a very, very interesting IT department. They want everybody to reset passwords every 90 days. That would be probably the time that it would set how many days this refresh token would live, like to match that IT policy, so that when I go reset my password, my mobile app and everything else will stop working, and all these refresh tokens will go away, and any security risks that posing out there floating in a sort of like internet will get automatically disabled, right? So that I get a new refresh token and my mobile app works, and my web apps works, and all that stuff, just all good.
Yeah, while you're on this page, as you guys are studying, learn all the different things you can do on this manage page and on the connected app page, because there's a lot of questions that dealt with, well, that basically you had to know what you could and could not configure through connected app settings, either through the policies or through the app itself. And there was a couple of things where I couldn't remember if you could do it through the manage.
Yeah, so there's definitely questions on these. I remember what you can do, relaxing IP restrictions, or when or how to relax, IP restrictions, or relaxing them on a profile or whatever.
Yeah. And I had questions about IP ranges, and I could not remember whether you could set IP ranges on the connected app, but you can.
That's it.
All right, we're going to end on time. Yay, awesome us. Okay, I will present very shortly. Window right there. All right, and so just a reminder, once again, the schedule and resource links, you're probably sick of this slide by now. And for next session, keep going with the flows. And Igor touched on these bearer assertion flows and bearer flows. So that's on the study list for this coming week. And then Friday's presenters are here. We got Winnie, Madhavi, Paulina, and John Daniel. And we're going to keep going through these flows. Again, on the exam, I had questions where they put the name of a flow that wasn't even a real flow as one of the options, but it sounded like a real flow. So definitely know the names of these things too, because they do come up on the exam.
Yeah, what I also found confusing is that sometimes they've noted on the exam or asking specific questions about a flow, but really they're listing, there may be a flow in there listed, but really the correct answer isn't really a flow. It's more of something like a scope that they're giving you or something like that. So it's definitely, as all of these exams, I think I have to take them 2 or 3 times because I just have to read English, right? So I need to get used to reading and hearing what are they trying to ask me here. It's not a matter of testing my knowledge, it's testing my English ability.
Yeah, yeah. And I had one of those, 5 I'm hoping it was one of the 5 ungraded questions, because it said refer to the diagram below, and there was no diagram on the page. So that made it really hard to answer the questions. I'm like, I hope this isn't one of the ungraded ones, because otherwise that's just not fair.
Yeah, I found some interesting thing there. There was, I had at least probably, if I can remember counting it, probably at least 10 questions that were directly mobile related, or Salesforce mobile app, or custom mobile app related questions. And obviously around connected app. But I know at least there was 2 questions that were exactly the same and had exactly the same answers. And I was like, didn't I just answer that? Wait a minute, am I going backwards? And I was going through, it's like, wait a minute, I've just answered the question. What? And they were basically slightly different wording of a sentence, but really the same thing. So I was really like baffled by that. It's like, what? Did I forget to answer that? What's going on?
I had that on the sharing and visibility exam, where it was like I kept answering the same question 5 times, it seemed like. And that's just the randomness of picking the questions that happens. So we are done for today then. Thank you all for joining, and we'll talk to everybody on Friday. As always, I'll hang around till last person drops, and recording is stopping now. Everybody have a great day.
Yep, do the same. Thank you.